Hello, everyone, and welcome to the joint Spnhc and Tdwg 2024 conference. This session is titled SYM03 Beyond Best Practice, Embracing the Value of Improvisation. My name is Bethany Palumbo. I'm your moderator today, and our co-moderator is Nicole Fellman. This year's meeting was made possible in part by the generosity of our sponsors, especially our diamond sponsors, and we are so grateful to them and to the Oki Congress for today's tech support. This session will be recorded for later viewing by registrants and eventually posted to the Spnhc and YouTube channel for public viewing. Thank you to you all for joining us today, and thank you to the speakers in the session. Each presenter will talk for 10 minutes-ish, and then there'll be a couple of minutes of questions at the end of each presentation. If you are attending virtually online, please ask questions of the speakers using the chat feature in Zoom, and Nicole will ask them on your behalf. If you are attending the session in person, please use the microphone to ask questions so that they can be heard by the online audience. And by participating in this conference, you agree to abide by the Spnhc Tdwg 2024 Code of Conduct. If any technical difficulties arise, we appreciate your patience, and please enjoy the session. So first up, we have Daniel Capping from the Field Museum in Chicago.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining me today. Today I'll be talking about the state of the celluloid models in the Field Museum collection, what we've been doing to prolong their display, and replication methods we are exploring to eventually replace conventional repairs. I gave a talk a few years ago focusing on our initial repairs, so the first half may be familiar to some of you. My note's a little too big. The Field Museum models were made by taxidermist Leon Walters and his colleagues in the first half of the 20th century. His method produces very accurate representations and is especially effective for specimens with finer translucent skin. Here's a quick overview of his celluloid method. Positioning and movement and color were observed in the wild or captivity. Often the animal was euthanized by drowning or using 1% chloratone, leaving the muscles relaxed. I'm not really sure what he did for narwhals and such large things. As we can see in the top left image of Walters with a baby hippo, supports were used to position the specimen. After positioning, a plaster mold was produced. Hair and feathers could be transferred to the model using wax. Pigmented cellulose nitrate was painted into the mold in layers in reverse, as you can see in the gorilla video in the top right, and the narwhal image on the bottom left. After drying, the mold was split to reveal the model for finishing. FTR analysis confirms that cellulose nitrate was Walter's material of choice. All the models we've tested so far have very similar spectra. If we zoom in on the fingerprint region, we can see that peaks indicate the nitrogen to oxygen bonds distinguishing the material from cellulose acetate. Unfortunately, cellulose nitrate has problems over time. Loss of plasticizer can cause shrinking and cracking. Exposure to atmospheric moisture promotes hydrolysis, where free nitrate groups combine with water to form nitric acid. And this process is autocatalytic, which is really a big problem if it's in a case or in a small storage space. The irreversible breakdown can only be slowed, usually with low temperature storage, but since display is the primary purpose of these models, cold storage is of little value to us, so repair and replication are our best options. Our first repairs were made with Aquazol 500, a polyoxazolene adhesive. Here's a repair on a 6-line race runner that I did in 2018 using Aquazol. The repairs remain unchanged today, but we have moved away from Aquazol. Its hygroscopic nature could encourage the hydrolysis. We've also been working with Beatvar B98, a polyvinyl butyrol copolymer. Here our summer graduate intern, Elena Best, is stabilizing a land iguana model using pigmented Beatvar. We've been using isopropanol as a solvent. Its lower toxicity is important because of the long-term and up-close nature of these treatments. We haven't had any problems with plasticizer or celluloid solubility so far with the isopropanol. However, if I did, or for the purpose of removing these fills later on, an aromatic solvent could be used. though exposure should be limited. BeepVar is also soluble in acetic acid, so it would be unsuitable for repairs on cellulose acetate models. If we run into any of those, we'll need to pivot to a different solvent and resin, possibly Paralite B67 and mineral spirits. So this is the first model I used BeepVar on extensively. It's an orangutan model that's been handled a number of times in public events over the years, and it has corresponding damage along the edges. Here's the largest loss located on the proper left flange. I reinforced the area with thin Japanese tissue in BeepVar, and I completed the fills with bulked and pigmented BeepVar. I'm curious to see how the BeepVar will interact with cellulose nitrate and nitric acid over time. This treatment's going on about 5 years, and it shows no visible change, though storage, handling, and display conditions will play a big factor in its longevity. We've also used heat to effectively manipulate deformed models. This lamprey model was reformed by my co-author, Mackenzie Fairchild, using a hot air tool at 60 C. Prior to treatment, Mackenzie ran heat tests in a protected space. On the right, you can see a sample from the lamprey and a fresh cellulose nitrate sample. The lamprey smokes but doesn't ignite. This is because Walter used cellulose nitrate with a lower degree of nitration and also used additives. So low heat is a gentle way to achieve gap closure on deformed regions. It reduces the risks of new breaks forming from stress and limits the amount of new added material. However, it can be difficult to control and cause changes to the surface appearance that can happen kind of subtly. And heating also accelerates reactions, possibly around the surrounding celluloid. Cast acrylic fills are also a good option when the surface is sturdy enough to take a silicone mold. Mackenzie employed this technique on our second iguana model. She used mold impressions to make tissue-back fills using golden acrylic mediums and paints. These fills offer a higher degree of reversibility. They could also have a more realistic appearance, as scale patterns are pretty difficult to model by hand. Larger structural damages required less reversible methods. Here's an American alligator model with major issues. The shrunken underlying layer has created large voids and a network of cracks over the entire surface. And the cracks are well hidden by the texture of the skin. Hopefully they'll hide my repairs as well. The worst area is the tail. It's split open, leaving an edge exposed and weak. Many of the top scales have crumbled away. And here it is in its current condition. I've restored the strength and shape, but I'm still kind of fussing with the appearance. So solvent and heat manipulation were not options because of a thick internal fabric and plaster backing layer. To bring the tail back into alignment, I heated a scalpel and cut the scales near their bases. I followed the natural recesses and existing breaks where I was able to. And then I made fills with a plaster of BeepVar and calcium carbonate. And this plaster is a little too opaque, so I'll only use it where the areas need a little more strength. With this last example, an Eastern coach whip model, we can discuss our replication attempts. As you can see, the before and after show typical damage and repair with bulked and pigmented BeepVar. It's got a lot of cracks, basically. I'm happy enough with the results, but the repairs took an awful long time, something like 8 months, just doing it on the side. Likewise, the life of the repairs in the original model substrate is still limited. Here's a little closer look at the repairs. So in its conserved state, it was the perfect time to make a 3D model, and we've done that using Creoform GoScan structured light scanner. The scanner works by emitting parallel beams of light that reflect off the surface of the scanned object, and then the scanner's camera detects the change in the light pattern and the software translates the deformations into depth and shape. On the right, you can see my co-author JP Brown's scanning setup. He's added a powder-coated steel base plate on a CNC cut turntable. There's also reflective stickers that were added to the base plate in a random pattern. And then 3D printed hexagonal scanning targets are attached with small magnets. And this all comes together with the stickers and the base plate to allow the scanner to lock on and increase the resolution. So a shorter side here. Since repairing these models manually has been very time consuming, we also tinkered around with digital repair. So this slide shows the prop right side of Mackenzie's iguana. The top right image shows the 3D scan of the damage, and the bottom right image shows the damage reduced using ZBrush digital sculpting software. So these repairs took me a couple of hours, but a person with more experience with the software could theoretically create printable models off of our scans relatively quickly. And back to the coach whip. After scanning, the digital model was 3D printed by Chris Haslam and Carl Bittekoffer in our education department using an Elegoo 3 ultra MSLA mass stereolithography resin printer using inland and ABS-like tough resins. Because of the build plate size limitations, the model was cut down into smaller segments in mesh mixer software, and supports were generated in Lychee Slicer. After printing, I started casting a replica with guidance from replication specialist Janice Lim and preparator Peter Rosen. Here you can see the assembled 3D print in the top left. The center image is a rebound 25 silicone mold of the 3D print. And the bottom right shows a supporting two-part mother mold using fiber-filled resin. Here's where we are today. We've produced a test replica cast in epoxy with inset acrylic eyes. Unfortunately, I haven't found a painting technique that yields good results, that gives us the translucency that we're looking for. To get the scale pattern right, I suspect we'll have to go back a few steps and make a plaster cast instead. Taking Walter's lead, we could paint in the scales in reverse prior to pouring the lighter colored core. We're also going to tinker around. We have a wet specimen of a lamprey that we're going to try to replicate Walter's methods with as well. And I must have talked really fast. So the future of these models may be uncertain. Nevertheless, we have found ways to extend their display life and restore the realism desired by their creators. We've also identified methods for creating replacement models from the originals. And while this still needs a little tweaking, we think that's something that can be achieved. And at the very least, we should be able to provide 3D files for future fabricators. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Are there any questions from the audience? If so, walk up to a microphone. All right, you're off the hook for now.
All right. Thank you.
We are a tiny bit early, so we'll just give it a couple minutes for our next speaker.
Hi again, for some of you. And
Let's get started. I can see that you're a keen beaver. So now we have Anastasia van Gever and Mikkel Bartholdi from the Natural History Museum of Denmark.
that's right. In that case, I'll skip the first part of my introduction. I'm here with Anastasia van Gever as well. We are working at the Natural History Museum of Denmark, as Bethany said, the NHMD, which is a part of the University of Copenhagen. That last part is crucial for some of our work we'll be describing here. Because we brought to you a talk about our work with deinstalling dioramas and the lessons we've learned from that. So the NHMD is currently building a new museum building, and the main objective of our conservation unit is to facilitate the new exhibitions in this building. This is particularly through object treatment and preventive conservation. In conjunction with this project, the Zoological Museum, where all of our dioramas are housed, is closing. It closed permanently to visitors in 2022, and the university who owns the building wants it emptied within the next few years. This means that last summer we were tasked with removing specimens from some of these dioramas at the closed museum to prepare them for display in these new galleries. Historically, dioramas and their place in exhibits are a widely discussed subject. And like other museums that have had to remove classic dioramas, we now have to deinstall some dioramas before this building is demolished. With the, we call it diorama discussion, fresh in mind, we tried to make the best of a situation that at best was uncomfortable for us as museum professionals. We could not preserve the whole dioramas, but it was crucial for us to approach this task of dismantling with a focus on documentation and with the preservation of as much material and information as we could do. This was all under heavy time constraints as we're trying to build a new museum. The dioramas that you just saw from the Zoological Museum, they're built over a period of 30 years, with the first few being finished in the 70s. The newest one is the walruses that was completed in '94. Habitat dioramas, just to have a short explanation, it's a traditional way of displaying specimens. They contain these lifelike animals set in a naturalistic habitat, often interacting with the environment. The content is enhanced with forced perspective and complex lighting systems to create an illusion of a real habitat. This complex but detailed exhibition type means that the dioramas have a very special place in many collections, and in they're not just like it's not just a showcase of specimens, but it's a showcase of artistry and model and painting and an approach to exhibition. The example we have right here is our copy diorama, which contains several taxidermy specimens. It also has dried and fake plants as part of the foreground material and a painted background and ceiling. Because the dioramas are so complex and like our focus wasn't just removing the taxidermy mounts, but also document in detail, as I mentioned. We aim to understand the crafting process as well as create a record before our invasive work could begin. We decided to use a combination of conservation best practice, photography and visual assessments, as well as a condition report template that we built specifically for the work with these dioramas. We had to do that to these practices were combined with opportunities that were made possible through our museum colleagues. The most prominent being 3D scans and interviews with the original makers when that was possible. But yeah, simply the goal was to retrieve, not just to retrieve the specimens, but also to make a record of these dioramas' conditions, builds, and materials. Working under a tight schedule, as soon as the glass panes were taken off, our digital team started 3D scanning. You can see the result of the walrus scanning here. These scans utilize a combination of photogrammetry and point cloud scanning, which allows for our scans to be to scale and accurate enough for later reference, should we need to do that. One issue though with these scans is that a 3D scan doesn't capture everything. The single scan, like, it doesn't curve around objects, and as you can see, and as you know, dioramas are full of objects. So we tried to move around and we tried to do that, but having the scans made before our own documentation allowed us to know exactly what stuff we should focus more on when we came to our own documentation. And here we get to that. So with the scans done, the conservation proceeded with our own documentation. We used digital photography as well as the condition report I mentioned that you see a part of right here. We designed it specifically for the dioramas because they were so multifaceted and we needed to record as much information as possible. An example of that is that we had to record details about technicalities like the lighting system, the filters, and everything else set in, which doesn't capture well on camera or on the 3D scans. The right is a diorama diagram created in the assessment. Yes, again, it's multifaceted. We need to keep our eyes on the ball. But additionally, the oral interviews with the dioramas makers carried out and helped us gain valuable insights about the build process for these dioramas. And when documentation was complete, we could start with the physical work. We planned how to remove each specimen in careful detail because getting into and moving inside the diorama, we had to avoid causing more damage than necessary. We also had to figure out the best places to move within these dioramas. And which materials to be taken out to reach the specimens. This careful planning and execution of it was crucial to protect both the specimens and the habitats they contained.
Hi everyone. So despite this planning and our best effort, we still face several challenges, and you can see the list here, and I will walk you through them and how we try to navigate around them. So to start with, a big challenge was our time constraints. For example, the removal of the glass windows could only be done on certain date. Same with the 3D scanning, and that was because of the availability of the machines and of the staff trained to use them. Thomas, a technician that you can see there, only works part-time, and he had to build all bespoke plinth for all the specimens in only 3 weeks, and that was the time we had between the opening of dioramas and the removal of specimens, and he couldn't do them beforehand because we didn't have specimen dimensions. So all this added extra pressure, and despite our best planning, it meant that certain things were not done. Another challenge was the unexpected weight and size of specimens, and it made their removal physically demanding. Each specimen required a different solution. The heaviest specimen was the rhino that you can see here, and big surprise, because who could have guessed that a rhino would be heavy? But it was even heavier than we expected, and it required an engine hoist and the whole conservation team. We should have known better, but it was really difficult to assess the weight of specimen because each taxidermy mount was made at a different time with different materials. We didn't know what the mannequins were made of, and we looked in the database and in the archives, but we couldn't find any information about the weight. So yes, that made it really tricky. And each specimen, to add to that difficulty, was also mounted in a different way. And with concealed mounting systems, which were hidden under the dioramas. So for example, the rhino, it was bolted down to a hidden wooden structure, which was hidden by the diorama because the diorama was built around it afterwards. And so we had to remove a lot of substrate to be able to access the nuts and bolts that were securing the specimen. The lack of space within the diorama and the broader exhibition space was another challenge. The dioramas were only accessible through the front window. And so safely maneuvering the specimens, which were large and heavy, within the dioramas, which were also full of habitat material, was extremely difficult. The orangutans were particularly difficult to deinstall because the mount needed to be moved with its habitat tree that you can see there. And we planned the removal of specimens, but underestimated just how cumbersome the specimens would be and how small the space would be to navigate with the whole conservation team in the space. It's not that big. Additionally, one of the main challenges with this project and with the new museum building in general is that plans are constantly evolving. And I think a lot of us who have worked on similar projects can understand this. Plans change constantly, the information is not always clear. Sometimes you also get told something and it's not final. So in the case of the orangutans, we didn't know exactly how much of the orangutan diorama we needed. We were told we wanted the mount with its habitat tree, but we didn't know the size of the habitat tree. We didn't know if it needed to come with the durian fruits or not. We didn't know if we needed extra branches and leaves and habitat material. So with this in mind, we made the best choices we could, and we tried to provide alternative options when possible. Another challenge was unexpected conservation issues, because once we were close to specimen, we realized they were all in much worse conditions than we expected. And that's because within the dioramas, with very low lighting, the specimens appeared to be in great condition, and once we took them out, they weren't. So that meant two things. That first, taking them out was much riskier because the specimens were actually not that stable. And second, that the conservation treatment would be much longer than planned. And you can see here an example of the okapi before and after treatment, and our colleague Nicole Feldman will talk about it later today if you want to listen to her talk. So reflecting on all this, those challenges really tested our team's communication, adaptability, and problem-solving skills. By collaborating with the digital, through these experiences, we learned valuable lessons, and we have developed a clearer understanding of diorama deinstallation. And the three main lessons we learned are first, that you should collaborate and integrate new techniques when possible. And by collaborating with the digital team and using 3D scanning and interview, we enhanced our documentation process for the benefit of both the conservation team and the collections. Second, you need to know your limits. It can be safer and quicker to hire professionals to work alongside your conservation team when they have experience of similar projects. And so we didn't hire a specialist moving team when we deinstalled the specimens, but we did hire them when it came to moving the specimens to a new location. And finally, it is important to find the balance between planning and staying flexible. We had planned for the whole project, but unexpected issues still arose, and we really had to adapt to delays and challenges. As we look forward, these lessons will inform our approach to similar projects at the NHMD, as there are still many dioramas that need to be deinstalled from the Zoology Museum. And an upcoming challenge is the deinstallation of the crane diorama that you can see on the screen. And this diorama was documented in the same way as the others last summer, but a particular challenge for it is that it needs to be moved in its entirety to the new museum. And a problem is also that the resin you can see there that looks like water has never fully set. So it is still sticky. The legs of the bird are stuck in the resin, and we need to move the whole thing. So if anyone has experience doing that, we would love to get some help and advice. And finally, thanks to you for listening, and thanks to everyone who has been involved in this project, because it was very much a group project.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? Mariana, go ahead.
Hi.
Of course.
Sorry. I have a question about the background paintings. Are those considered artwork? And if so, what are you going to do about that?
Should I? So I would consider them artwork. They aren't. But we have involved the archivist of the museum, we only have an archivist for the last 2 years. I think she started at the same time as we did. And I think she's quite interested in taking some of them for the archives. I don't think she can take all of them. And some of them are not even there's different types of paintings. There's paintings directly on the walls. There was also one that was more like a see-through painted screen with the light coming from the back. Like each diorama was super different, and because it was made over several decades.
But so you don't have the painter, the author, like that kind of information?
We do.
Oh, you do? Okay.
So a fun thing about like the oral interviews, a very typical thing. The painter doesn't consider it art because he was there as a, what do you call it? He called him himself, like he was a young troubled boy, and he just came there and then he started painting the backgrounds for some amazing dioramas. And he's an expensive artist now, and he thinks they're terrible. He thinks it's horrible, but that might also, in the end, make them more valuable. But yes, as Anastasia said, some of them are painted on wooden backgrounds, some are see-through photostates, and many of the ones you've seen here, the walrus, is on a, it's not plastic, what do you call it, concrete, like curved concrete background. So can we pull it off, or will we have to like take samples and whatnot? There's so much to get at there. Some of the backgrounds are not painted by this artist nowadays, but painted by the personnel that were there. So Marion Post, one of the conservators, she just up and painted a couple of backgrounds in a few days. Like, yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question, which is just, I love the fact that you interviewed the diorama makers, and could you share with us a bit more of the insight that they provided and what that process looked like when you interviewed them?
I couldn't remember much. so we really wanted to do the interview. We walked around everything, and obviously as the talk goes, more and more details come forth. We really wanted more insight into like specific materials and methods, like how did you place in this, because our archivals were not sufficient enough for our installation. It doesn't cover everything, but it's kind of indicative of how they built it, which was very these people were extremely skilled and artisans in that, but to them they just haphazardly threw it together, which was very interesting to hear about. And so it was a bit lacking. We had some funny questions about the fading of some of the backgrounds, the photo states. We had some musk oxen that had a nice yellow color, and we were talking about, is this natural? Is it the glue coming through? I thought it was like meant to be, and he came and said, yeah. As soon as we did that, this just started fading and the glue bled through, and we tried to hide it with the lighting. So we got a lot of nice anecdotes. There's a lot of mess around the walrus males who are pissing and shitting and fighting on the ice. And that was a happy accident. That was a reaction with the epoxy that stained it. And it looked so natural that they kept it. So those kinds of insights were fun and valuable to get. But it was more a trip down memory lane and filling out some smaller holes than we had hoped for. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Just to add, like, we did get some facts as well about the exact makers and more precise dates and things like that. But yeah, it was more fun facts.
It was really good. It was really good for our reports that we could say who made what, because we knew who worked when, but we had no idea that it was Marion making this diorama and Jan who taxidermized this and this. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And now we'll have our next speaker. And our next speaker is Erica Reed from the Natural History Museum in London.
Hello, yeah, oh, is that working? I am Erica and I work in the Conservation Department at the Natural History Museum in London, and I'm going to be talking about conserving a lichen-covered signpost that we collected earlier this year. The Natural History Museum in London is currently building a semi-permanent exhibition highlighting human impact on our planet, fixing our broken planet. Stories in the exhibition include current research being carried out to mitigate various issues. One such story showcases a weathered veteran signpost covered in various lichen species, the signpost you can see here. It was identified by curator Gauthami Wirakun, and it was standing on a remote spot in Exmoor National Park, southwest England. As soon as the post had been identified, the museum was keen that we act quickly to secure the specimen for the exhibition. Why did we need to act so quickly? On the left here, you can see the first post identified as a good example. It was removed from the moor and stored, but delays in collecting the post meant that the lichens degraded significantly. Some had died, some became detached from the wood, some had lost their colour, and they'd become mouldy. The second post on the right was a great example of large Usnea species, which are the lichen that indicate low pollution environments. But shockingly, it was stolen. It just disappeared from the moor one night before we could collect it. So we had to act quickly. As soon as the paperwork was complete, myself and fellow conservators, Ariana and Armando, booked out the museum pickup truck and headed off to meet the park ranger, Charlotte Ray, on Exmoor. Despite being in a remote location, the post was located next to a road. So with the guidance of the park ranger, we were able to get the van very close to the post. However, the weather was awful. It was really cold, there were strong winds, torrential rain, so it was tough. Luckily, we'd prepared for this. So top left, you can see my little mini mock-up that I used for planning the collection. Top right, you can see pre-cut layers of packing. A sheet of honeycomb metal sheet was pre-cut to snugly fit around the wheel arches of the van, onto which a sheet of plastozote was adhered with hot glue. Bottom left, you can see that when we arrived on site, we drew around the post onto 30mm plas, noting the areas that had lichen on the downward-facing side. These areas were cut out of the plastozote so that any remaining plastozote would support the wood of the post without touching any lichen. And bottom right, you can see the post was then laid flat into the back of the van, and additional layers of plastozote were used to support and secure the areas of wood not covered with lichen to prevent the post from shifting in transit. All these pieces of plastozote were held in place using long screws that went through all the layers of plastozote into the board below. You can see me using the electric screwdriver there to secure the supports. The packing method worked perfectly, and despite being driven back over 200 miles across bumpy, flooded roads, not a single lichen detached from the post all the way back to the museum. Once back at the museum, we put the post through our quarantine procedure to ensure that no pests were brought into the museum. Making use of my Christmas tree stand, we stood the post up so that it could dry out evenly before wrapping and freezing for 72 hours. Lichens are extremely resilient and they can survive drought and freezing temperatures. So once the post had been thawed, a light spray of water brought back the intense colours of the still alive wet lichen. And this is how we ideally wanted to present the post visually for the exhibition. Lichen within the collections are typically dried, kept in boxes or secured to sheets of paper. This way, the collections can be studied without any adhesives or other media interfering with analysis. This object, however, will never be used for lichen research. This post and its lichen were collected with a specific role in mind, to be a visually impactful and engaging display that shows visitors what lichen look like in their natural habitat. These lichen will be held vertically on their substrate for 10 years, and they need to remain firmly attached to it long after the lichen have dried and died. We wanted them to appear fresh and colourful, and for these reasons, the curator was happy for us to carry out much more interventive treatments than we normally would. We also wanted lots of clear examples of the lichen that indicate low pollution environments. Usnea, which you can see at the bottom left, you can see some small examples there. For this reason, the curator had also requested that we adhere larger additional lichens of those examples onto the post that had been sort of already found on the post. Once back at the museum conservation unit, this lichen quickly began to curl up and pull away from the post, so we had to quickly decide how best to stabilise them. We'd collected several fallen branches covered in lichen on site next to where the signpost had stood so that we could carry out some initial testing. We applied various consolidants and adhesives to see which appeared to work well. I'd expected water-based ones to work well, like Lascaux, Tdwg. They seemed to soak in well, but surprisingly, Paraloid B72 gave a great depth of colour and almost identical to a wet lichen. It gave the lichen a plump appearance and a wet sheen. It also gave the lichen a rigidity and appeared to adhere them quickly to the wooden substrate. For this reason, I decided to apply Paraloid B72 to the flatter lichens on the post to fix them in place quickly. Although this seemed to work well for the broader shield and leaf-like lichens, when applied to the bushy lichens like Usnea and Avernia, it was too heavy and caused clumping. So with the flat lichens stabilised and adhered to the wooden post, we continued to research how best to stabilise the other lichen. Here you can see the visual results of various media on sections of Avernia. The top line is untreated wet lichen. The second line are dry lichen after having been treated, and the bottom line 3 weeks after treatment. The majority had become shriveled and brittle after 3 weeks. Both Lascaux samples were stronger with a little flex. The Paraloid was very strong, but after 3 weeks, the initial intense colour had faded far more quickly than the others. And you can see that one on the bottom row, third in from the right. Initially, the fading caused by the Paraloid was rather worrying. However, we know that lichens are very light sensitive and fade very quickly anyway. This branch had been on display for some years in the museum already, and with the signpost destined to be on display for 10 years, and the fact that we knew we wanted the lichen to appear fresh, we were always aware that we were probably going to have to colour them in some way. We also put those samples that you saw a couple of slides back through micro CT scanner to see what was going on inside. This is a quick overview. You can see the notable differences here. Untreated lichen on the left, followed by Paraloid B72, Lascaux 498, Lascaux medium for consolidation. So taking a closer look, the orange is the media that's on the lichen. You can see that the Paraloid has a thick external layer of clear resin, and you can also see trapped air bubbles in here too. There's not much inside. And the Lascaux 498 mostly sat on the surface, but traces were found internally. Tdwg was similar with a little more penetration. However, the Lascaux medium penetrated well into the body of the lichen and didn't sit on the surface or cause the clumping issue. So based on these tests, we decided to proceed using Lascaux medium for consolidation for the additional lichen. This is a quick comparison to the hydrated lichen on Avernia and Ramalina lichens. So visually, the Lascaux medium gave them a more saturated appearance, resembling the wet lichen. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than leaving it dry. The Lascaux also strengthened the lichen physically, leaving it much less brittle. It was light in consistency, so we were also able to spray the lichen evenly. Guided by the curator, new positions for the additional lichens, Usnea, Avernia, and Ramalina, were then found on the post. And then Lascaux medium for consolidation was then applied to these lichen using a fine spray bottle. These were then left to dry on silicone-covered supports, mimicking the space that they'd occupy on the post. And once dry, a fine mist of core watercolour was applied, with the excess being removed with a dry paintbrush. These lichen were then adhered in place with a small amount of Paraloid B72. The rest of the lichen on the post were then painted to match the colour they were when they were collected with the core watercolours. The colours used had passed Audi testing for temporary use only. However, as this is a mixed media object, it will be alone in a case and it will never be used for research. The use was justified. And here you can see the recolouring so far. Left is the original, centre is dried after consolidating, and right is how it currently is, having had the watercolour added. And finally, there's the finished, not quite, lichen signpost, which will appear in the exhibition, and the curator's really happy with the look of the specimen. So what would I do differently and what's coming next? I'd like to carry out a bit more research into whether Lascaux medium or any other adhesives that I didn't have to hand immediately would have worked better for those leaf-like lichens. And also, we're going to be adding more larger usnea to the post once they've been collected. So we're looking at using freeze drying and critical point drying before consolidation to see if that has any positive effect. We're going to continue to monitor over the next few weeks and keep adjusting the colour to get as near perfect match as I can. And we're also going to continue to monitor for any fading or physical changes to the lichen over the next 10 years to help inform future projects. So thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you to all of these people, as well as the whole team at the Natural History Museum in London, who were all really helpful. I went really fast, too fast.
Thank you, Erica. I think I speak on behalf of all the conservators in the room that I've never been so excited about lichen. That was really, really awesome.
I love them.
My question for you is, will you be writing this up?
Well, Nikki and I have also got a new lichen project sort of coming up, so might be writing this up, or it might be combined with another lichen project because they're great and we love them now.
Yes,
so.
please share. Awesome, thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
Hi, I think you've got the dream job ever. I'm really jealous. That was amazing. My question is, did you replace that sign for the footpath walkers?
I realised
in that
way,
like, you don't want to get lost.
It's something I always tell when people come to the lab and see it. It's like, don't worry, people can still get to 20 Shoe. So we were only notified by the park when they knew there was a post they needed to replace. So those other ones came off, well, one got stolen, but the first one was removed and replaced, and we left the park ranger in the park, and I think she was putting up the new sign as we drove back via somewhere to get a cream tea. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Great, thank you so much. Oh, there is an online question, Erica. Back to the mic.
Sorry, you have to walk right back up. We have a question. Can the medium spray protect the specimens from bugs or molds during exhibition?
I don't think the spray particularly can, but obviously we have quite strict. It's going to be in a case and the environments are going to be monitored, and we have lots of pest monitoring. So those are the ways we're going to be protecting the post from pests and mold.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Erica. Our next presenter is Kirby Martino from the University of Amsterdam.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm not actually a natural history conservator. My name is Kirby Martino, and I've been trained primarily in the conservation of wood and furniture. So today, in the spirit of this session about improvisation, I want to talk about a small section of a research project that I performed as part of my postmaster's program in 2023. Here I investigated suitable structural support for 2 wax-injected anatomical preparations. I'd like to highlight the advantages and the disadvantages of approaching work as someone trained primarily in the conservation of wooden furniture. Is it this? Yeah. Great. So I'll briefly, in 10 minutes, talk about the objects themselves, my research, and how I approached it, and then finally, the next steps I would like to take. So the objects discussed, and you can see them on display in the museum. consists of 2 wax-injected hearts belonging to the Museum Vrolijk, prepared by the early 19th century anatomist William Vrolijk in the early 1800s. The hearts, both from a camel on the left and a moose on the right, are filled with red and blue wax in order to differentiate the chambers. They've been dried, then varnished, and they are displayed upon a painted wood board with handwritten labels identifying them both. To the far right is a photo I took during an attempt at a historical reconstruction to better understand how exactly one can inject an organ with wax, and it's very difficult. I'm a better conservator than I am an anatomist, I think. So, as you saw in the previous slide, these hearts are displayed in a case without climate control and are thus subject to fluctuating temperature and humidity. This is evident both in the darkening of the varnish as well as the cracking and crazing. It flakes off when you touch these objects to move. There's also significant sections of organ skin missing from prior pest infestations, although it is currently not infested. But most importantly, for my talk and for my research, I was really interested in these detached organs that you can see on the bottom right. So this is the research question that I was working with for my project, but also in my article. And all this essentially to say, how do you reattach an artery to a heart? Arteries are tubes. They're irregularly shaped, and these, because of their age and their materials, are extremely fragile. So whatever solutions I came up with had to take those both into account. So as a wooden conservator furniture, my first thought was clamps. You've heard when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're a wooden furniture conservator, everything could use a clamp. So these are past examples of work adhering walnut to a broken chair leg, adhering strip lining to gilt leather upholstery, and adhering veneer to a panel for a personal project. And what these images all have in common is that I'm exerting a fair amount of pressure onto the object, and I'm also flattening it. And neither of these things are appropriate for something as fragile and irregularly shaped as the Vrolijk hearts. So what to do? I started to look really closely at these objects, specifically the broken edges of the artery, and I noticed 2 things. In one, you could actually access the very thick width of the organ material, as you can see on the bottom. Yeah. And then in some areas, there's actually a sizable gap in between the wood and the organ material, owing to an uneven rate of shrinkage, I think, during both the making process and aging, where you can insert a slip of Japanese tissue paper if you so wanted to, which I did. So I started to work through my ideas by drawing diagrams, and in these diagrams, the red represents the wax, the yellow represents the organ. This is a head-on view. And this was kind of my first thought. The most obvious solution might be to take some Japanese tissue, basically slap a bandage on it. But I was unsatisfied with this for 2 reasons. I don't think that this would be visually congruent, but also, as I mentioned, the varnish layer is very degraded. It's flaking off, and I think a good candidate for further conservation. So I'm hesitant to do anything that would adhere to this unstable varnish layer, but also would have to be removed for any further treatment. But thinking back to that gap in between the wax and the organ material, would it maybe be possible to insert a patch or a fill, a repair, into that gap? Maybe. But in order to do that, I would need the right substrate and the right adhesive. And this is where I think it's particularly obvious that I was trained in wooden furniture rather than natural history or book and paper. After a pretty extensive literature review, I started testing every adhesive I could find in the wooden furniture studio, and then I also bothered the other specializations for their glues as well. And this is only a small fraction of the substrates and adhesives I tested. And in the end, I really liked the working properties of 1-to-1 Klucel G, 10% Klucel G and Evicon R, potentially because it was very reminiscent of hide glue, which is a wooden furniture standard, but unfortunately not suitable for natural history objects. This adhesive, when mixed, it's thick, it's grabby and sticky. Nothing will slide, but it has a long enough open time that you can put something in place and then adjust it to where you want it. I particularly liked this one combined with 19-gram and 32-gram Japanese tissue paper. I coated the paper, let it dry, and then I had this bespoke tape. And I came up with 3 distinct methods of how I might bridge the gap, so to speak. So I made 3D models. I used more clamps to hold these 3D representations of the organ material. The wood as stand-in for the wax, the parchment as stand-in for the organ material itself. And then I wanted to see this idea of inserting that fill works on paper. It worked when I conceived of it in a frenzy trying to figure out what I might do. But would it work 3-dimensionally in real life, or as real as you can get with this facsimile? I think so, actually. So I came up with first the tube join method. It was my first idea of, can you insert something in between that wax and that organ material? So this is a slip of 19-gram Japanese tissue paper coated in the mixed adhesive, allowed to dry, and then a glue line is applied on the inside of the organ material. And this is very important because applying the glue line to the inside of the organ material works. Applying glue to the Japanese tissue paper makes it soggy, it doesn't hold its shape. But when you take your coated Japanese tissue paper, roll it, and insert it into a tube, it naturally expands to fill the space. It exerts pressure onto the applied glue and in a way acts as its own clamp. You don't need to use any external apparatus. You're not flattening, you're not squeezing, and you're not applying too much pressure. And so then from there, rinse and repeat, do the same on the other side. And from there, you have a well-adhered, solid connection in between 2 pieces of organ material. So now you're no longer at risk of disassociation, and you've provided some visual unity. Equally creatively named, I had a lot going on at this point trying to get through this research, is the bridge join method. This one is the same principle, but rather than adhering a tube to the entire circumference of the organ material, it relies on just a small strip to make that join, still preventing disassociation, but minimally invasive, and then for visual unity, another tube. This is a tube-based solution. And then finally, the edge join method, still using the same adhesive, still using the same Japanese tissue. A tube inserted, ringed with feathered Japanese tissue that can kind of grab the exposed edge of the organ material, which is one of the reasons that this grabby adhesive is so important. It wants to stick in the same way that animal glue kind of wants to stick. And so even though I'm done with this research project of 3 months and I'm done with my postgraduate studies, I'm hopefully not done with these objects. I think they're fascinating. And even though they were common enough to warrant handbooks, they're kind of hard to find in collections now. So I'm interested in further diagnostic testing of the wax and organ material. I was limited in what testing I could conduct. I am interested in the aging and degradation testing of the adhesive solutions. People I've talked to have different opinions on what happens when you mix Klucel G and a proprietary glue like Lasco. And I'm also finally interested in everyone's favorite part, actually applying my solutions to the objects and seeing if it works for a 3rd time. So I have to thank so many people, but not least of all, you here listening to me today, to the conference, and to the moderators. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Any questions for Kirby about the waxy hearts or guts or other organs?
Hi. Do you think the tissue is going to be strong enough to make the physical join without a dowel between the two sides of the...
I think so, because these are fairly supported by the wooden base, but what I would rather than a dowel, because that was one of my first ideas, what about a small carbon fiber rod in the wax? I would rather see external support provided to this object. I think that the tissue is strong enough to provide some support, and more than that, it's strong enough to prevent these arteries from rolling away and getting lost in a collection somewhere.
Any other questions?
Do you see the current state of the wax at the break as important? Have you thought at all about maybe heating those two back together?
I'm hesitant to do much to the wax because I think that heating it back together in the long term could work, but the wax is actually really fragile and crumbly. It's not nearly as solid as you might hope it would be. And I also still have a lot of unanswered questions about the exact makeup of the wax. I can look to handbooks and I can look to guidebooks about how you are supposed to make wax injections. But whether or not William Vrolik was following those recipes, which recipes he was following, what materials he had available in his studio, I still think that there's a lot of work to be done before I'd feel comfortable doing much to the wax itself.
Thank you, Kirby. Round of applause.
Thank you.
We now have 3 minutes spare, so we're just going to have a quick break if anyone needs the loo or needs to go get a cup of coffee or something. 3 minutes. Okay, everyone, continuing this most excellent natural history conservation session, we now have Nicola Harrison from the Natural History Museum in London.
Just move that a bit shorter. Okay, to start. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. As Bethany said, my name's Nikki Harrison. I'm a conservator at the Natural History Museum, and I'm talking today about a treatment project I completed. So turning a mistake into an opportunity, the conservation of a barn swallow nest for exhibition. So this treatment was completed as part of a temporary exhibition project. This exhibition, Birds, Brilliant and Bizarre, opened to the public in May 2024 and will remain open until January 2025. So there is still time to visit if you fancy popping to London. Exhibitions provide great opportunities to improve the condition of specimens. When a specimen is selected for display, it becomes a priority. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with having to balance shifting priorities, and often it is not until a specimen is selected for display that we're able to complete certain remedial treatments. Despite this, we didn't foresee needing any treatments for birds' nests during exhibition preparation. Our planned approach was to complete condition assessments and documentation with no remedial treatments expected. We did hope to improve the condition documentation of the nest selected for display, for example, using a grid system to document this rook's nest pictured to better assess any movement during transport and during display. However, an unforeseen accident led to an even bigger opportunity. Now, while many people might recognise the iconic Natural History Museum building in central London, not all of our collections are stored or displayed there. In the countryside north of London is the Natural History Museum at Tring, where the vast majority of our ornithology collection is stored and many wonderful items from our collection are displayed. The NHM at Tring began as the personal collection of Walter Rothschild and was opened to the public in 1892. The collections and public museum were then gifted to the Natural History Museum in 1937. Many of the specimens chosen for display in Birds, Brilliant and Bizarre came from the displays and collections held at Tring. The NHM at Tring does not have a dedicated conservation space, and no conservation team members are based at this museum. With no available space for the specimens to be treated, all the specimens needed to be packed and transported to the main South Kensington site to our Conservation Centre studio. It was during the packing of specimens that an accident occurred, leading to the physical damage of a barn swallow nest. The specimen was being packed by in-house staff while it was dropped. While I have already said that exhibitions create opportunities for conservation, they also increase the risk to specimens. Handling, transporting, conservation treatment itself all increase the risk of physical damage. The damage was instantly visible: physical damage to the structure, areas of loss, and detached fragments. The fall had also caused new movement through the structure, and the accident was immediately reported and images taken. And this image is actually taken from our EMU database, so it also went on there as well, which is fantastic. Now, while everything in our collection is valued and important, this barn swallow nest has an unusually detailed accession history and socio-historical importance. This nest forms part of a small collection of barn swallow nests by the noted ornithologist John Gould, collected by his son Franklin on the 25th of May, 1861. This collection of nests is very popular for display and research. Other examples from the collection have been loaned to other institutions and displayed at the NHM previously. And we were actually lucky enough that our photo unit took this lovely image pre-fall for a publication. Lost my page. It was because of the historical importance and the popularity of this collection of barn swallow nests that the damage was reassessed as an opportunity. Another specimen from the collection had been damaged while on loan, and instead of slowly moving through the collection and potentially damaging more, it was decided to undertake remedial treatment to conserve this specimen and make it the display option. This decision was reached in collaboration with the curator, who first saw the opportunity created by this accident. Our typical approach at the NHM is to rely on preventive conservation methods to protect and preserve our nest collections. This accident provided the opportunity to research remedial treatment options, modern and historic, for mud-based birds' nests, to reassess our approach at the NHM, and to collaborate with different colleagues. My first step was to research existing treatment processes for repairing mud nests, or birds' nests in general, at the NHM. This included discussing treatment options with my conservation and curatorial colleagues. We have a great team at the museum, and it can never be underestimated how useful it is to just put something out on your workbench and talk to people as they pass it by. Unfortunately, as I expected based on our typical approach, no one was able to provide direct experience of completing remedial treatment on birds' nests or mud nests at the museum. After this, I then began to look outside of the museum to other procedures and practices being used elsewhere. While I did find a historical reference to plastic sprays being used on nests, I struggled to find any modern or recent examples of adhesives being used to stabilize, repair, or secure birds' nests in a museum setting. Because of this lack of information, I turned to other areas of conservation for inspiration. The construction of a barn swallow nest is that of wet mud with layers of straw-like grasses securing the mass together. Hair-like fibers and feathers are also often visible. While the specimens we work on are always treated within the context of their use in natural history research, they, like any museum object, are also the sum of their individual parts and organic materials. Looking at the nest as dry mud opened up consolidation treatments described by conservators working on art and ethnographic collections. Treatments I believe could be successfully utilized for this treatment. My research then provided some options for consideration: Lascaux, Tdwg, Primal, Paraloid B72. Unfortunately, because this treatment was part of an exhibition project, I had a strict deadline in which to complete this treatment, especially if the success of the treatment was unknown and alternative display options were going to be needed. This limited testing time, and I needed to evaluate these options using past experience. To do this, I really thought about what I wanted the adhesive to do. Strengthen the mud where it is friable, strengthen the bond between mud layers which have become separated, limit surface color change and surface texture change, use materials that can be distinguished from original materials in the nest, have multiple application methods, could be used in conjunction with fill materials. In addition, the adhesive also needed to be readily available. As I have previously said, the treatment was time sensitive because of the exhibition program. Ultimately, and it's well timed after the last talk, this led me to a choice of Tdwg, an adhesive I've used sporadically for natural history treatments, but more consistently in other areas of conservation. I completed testing in an inconspicuous place and was happy with the results. I then discussed the testing with the curator to get his approval. The nest was consolidated using Tdwg and isopropanol to further reduce the risk of surface color change. I began by using a syringe to apply the adhesive as a consolidant to friable areas before moving on to use a brush to apply. The Tdwg successfully stabilized friable surfaces and also secured some sections where the mud layers had separated. However, I realized the adhesive was not thick enough to create a join between larger gaps, and I would need to use a fill material. I chose Japanese tissue to create a fill by mixing with Tdwg to make a sort of paper pulp. Once cured, I then painted the tissue to match the mud substrate. I was also able to reattach the detached section using the Japanese tissue pulp with the Tdwg. And you can see in the image that like larger wet section of tissue. I also added Japanese tissue fake straw along the back of the nest to try and connect the two sides. It was only partially successful in doing this, but it does create some protection for this fragile side of the nest and the feathers within the nest. To ensure there was a good record of the treatment, I created visual treatment maps to locate areas of the consolidation and gap fills. While part of the justification for treatment was the agreement to make this the display specimen of choice, I didn't want to remove the potential of future research by not noting areas that were consolidated. And here again, you can just see a before image with the physical damage and the detached sections and loss. And then this shows the after treatment. You can probably see some of the tissue here. Hopefully they are disguised at a distance but visible in close inspection. You can also see a total lack of surface color or texture change on the consolidated areas, of which there were a lot. And as such, I am very happy with the treatment. It successfully repaired some of the physical damage from the fall and stabilized the nest for display. However, the structure of the nest is still inherently fragile. It is not a full circle, and life of the nest would have been made against an external surface, and as such, there's a gap at the back where the nest would have been attached. And here is an image of the nest on display in the exhibition. Because of that inherent fragility, I was also able to collaborate with members of our mount-making team to design a bespoke mount to support the nest on display and in long-term storage. So while the treatment was successful, I was still frustrated that I hadn't been able to test other options for the consolidation of the nest. After the exhibition was installed and with some more time available, I was able to go back and use the few unreattachable fragments to conduct some testing, bench testing, with other adhesives I considered for treatment. It hadn't been clear before the treatment had been fully completed how many fragments would remain unattached and could therefore be tested on. The curator was also happy for me to do this, and so I tested the following: Tdwg in isopropanol, Tdwg in ethanol, Lascaux medium from consolidation, and Paralo B72. Unfortunately, the images on the screen do not fully show the appearance in person, but the adhesives performed as I expected, which was gratifying, but I would like to test more adhesives, and I hope to work with the curator to find more appropriate testing materials from the collections. And then this leads me to next steps in the project. Once the exhibition closes, I will be able to condition assess the nest for any changes and assess how the treatment has survived display. I will then be able to work with the mount making team to further adapt the current mount for long-term storage. I also hope to continue researching the conservation of nests, and am hopeful that presenting here today will open up more conversation around the treatment of nests and the options available to us as conservators working to preserve nest collections. And then I just want to say many thanks for everyone here for listening to me today. And I also want to thank Douglas Russell, Senior Curator for Birds, Eggs and Nests, for his support and guidance on this project, as well as my conservation and mount making colleagues and the NHM Science team for supporting my attendance at the conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nikki. Have we got any questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you. How will you mark the specimen once it returns to the collection with your diagrams of the reconstruction you did?
And so all of those images will go onto the museum database. So they'll be part of our multimedia. So we use KEMU at the Natural History Museum. So it'll be part of the multimedia images that are attached to the process record, which is our conservation record.
Will you have any annotation label like with the nest indicating that they should check the database?
Yeah, I might now. So thank you for the question. Yeah, I hadn't thought about putting something physically in the collection space, but actually I will discuss that with the curator and see if we can include that in the pack. So saying for the next step, the plan is for the nest to remain in its storage, in its display mount in storage, so it can be easily displayed in the future. And so maybe as part of that whole container, we will include that information. So yeah, thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, our next speaker today is Mariana Di Giacomo from the Yale Peabody Museum.
Hello, everybody. Okay, I'm going to be telling you a tale of two halves, a treatment of a 19th century Gavialis congreticus taxidermy mount, and you will see why I chose that title. It is because it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. At the Peabody, we embarked in a ginormous renovation, and yes, it was the best of times because you know, you love a renovation. Everybody's very excited about that. You want a new museum, super exciting, super fun, but very stressful at the same time. And that renovation involved, you know, a gallery that was going to have amazing specimens in it and a case in the middle of the gallery that involved, if you can see, this specimen in the middle. However, there was a problem. Greg was not the problem. Greg was not the problem. The problem is that it was cut in half. So yeah, it was not cut in half initially. We have some idea that this specimen, we think, with Greg, we have been thinking about this for a while, that this specimen was collected in the 1870s. We did some research. We think it was collected by Hornaday, who was a taxidermist, proponent of conservation, the other conservation of wildlife. And he traveled to India, collected gavials, and the Peabody acquired this specimen in 1890. And reading Hornaday's records, he said that he collected gavials, not this one this long. This one is 17 feet, 5.2 meters. And we have this photo from 1931. George Whelan, who was a paleontologist, paleobotanist, he was posing this to something else, but the gavial is here. And you can see that it was one piece, not two. The problem is that at some point, someone decided to take it off exhibit. And I don't know if the doors had changed, something changed, or nothing changed. And still people decided that it was awkward to move. And they decided that it was a good idea to, pardon my French, in half. So, and that was in the 1990s. So for 100 years, it was full. And someone decided that it, and before I was able to start working on this specimen with my team, someone else worked on it. And unfortunately, between the 1990s and the 2010s, late 2010s, some ugly things happened. It lost some toes, it had some cracks, it lost some teeth, some things happened. And in the late 2010s and 2020 during COVID, so I was not able to, supervise any work, a preparator did some work on it that I was not able to supervise. I was not able to check on this work. And this person did work to the face, to teeth, toes, etc. So there was some reconstruction done, some attempt to put it back together with some screws. There was some removal of filling, some windows cut on it, some more cuts, some dowel situations, efforts done, some cuts to the original scales, some choices. So I decided to come in at one point and say, I'm taking over. And the work was going to be done in a shared conservation lab where other colleagues from other units were going to be. So I said, the first thing I'm going to do is some X-ray fluorescence. I need to know what is in this specimen because I'm going to be sharing the space with other colleagues. And huzzah, arsenic and lead, because taxidermy, duh. And so we decided to have a cleaning protocol that allowed us to be very cognizant of these materials that we were using, every cotton swab, every glove, everything that touched this specimen and many other specimens that we worked on were going to be thrown out in specific containers so that they would not contaminate the trash. Everything had a separate location. Everything was cleaned specifically, and any blades or anything that was cleaned, and everything went into that container. We worked with environmental health and safety to do that. And luckily, once the container was full, environmental health and safety tested our trash to make sure it was or was not hazardous. And luckily, we came between 5 to 10 times below the threshold for hazmat. So that was a good thing. But we did not know that, and we decided to be very safe at the time. But we had to move the gavial into the lab in 2 pieces, because, and decided to examine the animal. We started with some documentation, at first very rough, writing all of the problems, because they were not a few. It was 17 feet of problems. Many conservation issues, And again, many choices of fills that we did not understand. The windows that I was telling you about, these windows are access windows so that you can put it back together with screws that you need to get your hand inside the animal. And other fills, some original, plaster, some not original, with some choices that I will show you next. But we also decided to x-ray the beast because we wanted to know what was going on inside. The x-ray is usually used for art and smaller things, not 17 feet of art. And so it did not fit in the thing. So we had to take many x-rays in many weird positions for the animal. So some of the x-rays are going to be kind of weird, but we found some cool stuff. It has the original skull inside. It has some very strangely positioned nails, wires that are doing all of the tension of the head lifted are those wires. Very cool. The scales are there. Again, fun situations with, you know. We also, again, saw the scales, the nails, screws, you know. But my favorite, by far, is the hand of the taxidermist in the shape of a needle. We don't know if at some point they were, you know, and it just fell in and they were, well, or it was too short of a thread and then they couldn't tie and they just like decided to leave it in. We don't know what the situation was, but we just love that at some point the needle was left inside. So the first thing we did was clean a lot. We did a few tests and then we cleaned a lot. Here, this part is clean, this part is not. It was very, very dirty. And at one point I was like, it's big. It's not that heavy, but it's very big and awkward. So thinking about, you know, ideas and different things, it's like, I need the gantry. So Nate, that's Nate. Nate, we need the gantry. And he was like, what? Yes, we need the gantry. For what? For the gavial. Huh. Yes, because we need to lift the gavial to work on the underneath. And that's what we did. We decided to lift this animal, well, both parts of the animal, one at a time, to clean and work on the underneath. And some of the things we had to work on were those things. Bondo. Bondo is what you use to repair cars. And that was what I was talking about, choices. So this is Sophie. Sophie is one of the interns that worked with me. Sophie had worked on paper conservation before. And so this is the first time working with objects. And she had the hand of a paper conservator when she started working with me. And so she started trying to clean up all this Bondo. And I'm like, Sophie, hammer and chisel. And so we hammered and chiseled the Bondo off, and that's Sophie, hammer and chiseling Bondo. And look, great. We stabilized it a lot of Japanese tissue, a lot of Lasco with a lot of bulking agents. The tail work that had been done before was with Viva. It was very clear and translucent. We hated that. So we covered the tail with a lot of Japanese tissue so that we would not have that translucency anymore. And also we gave it some texture so that it would look like a scale again. We had to remake some toes because they were missing. And reconstruct some ugly situations and make them less ugly. He had a little bit of facelift at one point because, again, cracks and problems everywhere. But then he went back to the museum in 2 parts because it wouldn't fit in the truck. And then we screwed him back together using the holes and the access things and all of, and a very, very, very long attachment for the drill. And then we put him into the case. A lot of us, including Greg, who has said he was not a problem. So we put him inside the case very slowly, very delicately. And then we had to work inside the case on the seam because we were afraid it would flex And so we had to work inside. And after all of this work, of working on the seam, and my interns were doing amazing work, because like, what seam? Huh? They did such fantastic work. And then 2 days before we reopened, someone kneed a knee to the face. So Sophie, there she is, working. The cool thing, however, is that someone at some point reconstructed the eye, gave it a different shape that gavials don't have. So we actually saw the original eye under the new eye, which was super cool. We were able to take that photo, but then we had to put it back to the new eye because we were opening in 2 days. And they named him Gabe, and that's Gabe inside the case. So I want to thank the fantastic 3 interns that work with me, Sophie, Jasmine, and Anna Colette. I want to thank IPCH that did the x-rays, all of you guys for listening, and the organizers. You can contact me through any of these ways, and I am happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
I have a question. You touched on it very briefly, but could you elaborate more on what you use to clean the specimen and what you'd recommend for cleaning taxidermied reptiles?
Yes. So this one in particular, we were just using a mix of 1-to-1 deionized water and ethanol, because the dirt was a little bit sticky, but not too sticky. And so we needed something that was a little bit more than just water. And we knew that he had a little bit of varnish on him, so we didn't want to use something that was too harsh on, and also we were afraid that the previous person that had worked on him, we don't know how much he had painted. And so we didn't want to go too overboard with solvents, but we needed something a little bit stronger than water. So we ended up choosing that 1-to-1 ratio of deionized water and ethanol.
Hi, what did you use to do the in-painting?
We use, oh my gosh, just acrylics. Yeah.
And I have another question. For those in the audience who don't know, Japanese tissue is something we just throw about because we're super familiar with it. But could you elaborate a little bit more on what that material is and what we use it for?
So these papers are papers that they have different weights and different, they don't have, they don't age in a way like normal printing paper does, and they have, the way that they are designed and created, you can like break them off, but they have, again, different tension, so you can choose which tension you want, and as it was spoken about in the heart and the artery, you can choose which one you will use so that it will be as flexible or as stiff as you need it to be. So they are different kinds of paper that you will use depending on your needs. So for example, for the belly, we would use stiffer Japanese tissue because we would need a little bit more tension. But sometimes when we needed to reconstruct areas of the scales, we would use something that was a little bit softer, that would give us a little bit more give. So these papers, and we're in Japan, are made here. And they are traditionally made. They're absolutely fantastic. There's histories of hundreds of years of making these papers. And there are schools of making these papers, and the people who made them train for, many, many years to make them as well. So they are just fabulous tools that we use in conservation.
Hi, I was wondering how you guys were able to fix that face damage in 2 days.
I'm going to say that our director of public programming, after we finished, said that if his mom was still alive, he would introduce me to her because he was like very happy that we were able to achieve that. It was just a lot of work, essentially. It's just like inside the case the entire 2 days almost for Sophie, because the thing fell off, it cracked. So essentially what had to be done was just like put it back on and just do all that Japanese tissue, just filling a lot of that. And then in painting a lot of that and filling and hoping that the glue would dry fast enough and hoping that the paint would dry fast enough. A lot of hoping and a lot of wishing and a lot of hoping that nobody would come with another knee. And yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we have one more speaker, and then at 1:45, we're actually going to be hosting a panel session, so please stay for that when we can talk about each of these presentations in more detail. Our next speaker is Devon Lee, and she's from the Institute of Fine Art at the New York University.
Sorry, I'm not an iPad user. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Devon Lee, and I'm a graduate student specializing in the conservation of natural history collections at the Conservation Center of the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. And I'm thrilled to be closing out the session today to share another messy and sort of harrowing taxidermy conservation treatment that I completed in New York at the American Museum of Natural History, AMNH, under the supervision of natural science conservator Julia Sobalski. So today I will be telling you about this Ovis canadensis, or bighorn sheep trophy mount. This shoulder mount was prepared in 1967 by the taxidermy shop of Jess Frost in Cody, Wyoming, and it has hung from a wall in the AMNH Department of Mammalogy since at least the 1990s. The mount was brought to the conservation lab for treatment because, as you can see around the base of the neck here, an apparent structural failure of the front and sides of the internal form or mannequin had caused the shoulder mount to sort of telescope inward upon itself. So this is an unusual condition issue that I hadn't seen before, and it produced a disfiguring shrugging effect and movement and instability around the neck that rendered the mount both visually inappropriate and unsafe for display. So the goals for this treatment were fairly standard. If this had been a research specimen, I would have been less focused on the cosmetic damage to the mount and more concerned with its chemical stability and accessibility for study and sampling. But because this is a trophy mount with some historical value, I was most concerned with restoring its anatomical accuracy, visual appearance, and ability to be safely displayed. But achieving these goals was a little less straightforward. Visual examination yielded little insight into the reason the mount had collapsed, as the exterior was actually in quite good condition. The skin and fur around the neck were deformed and creased, but otherwise completely intact. So in order to fully understand the condition of the mount, and indeed to do anything about it, I had to call upon some of the guiding foundational principles of my conservation training. Employ minimally interventive methods and materials when possible, retain and preserve original materials, and do no harm to the object. So the first thing I did was grab a hacksaw. In order to stabilize this mount, I needed to access the interior form, and that necessitated removing the backing board, shown here on the left. Using twill tape and dense ethafoam blocks, I secured the mount to a temporary stand, shown on the right, and positioned it at a 45-degree angle to remove the weight of the horns from the damaged neck and allow me to access the backing board. I used a magnet and blue tape to locate and mark each nail and staple that had been driven through the skin and form to affix the backing board to the mount originally, and I opted to cut through these nails rather than attempt to pull them out and risk tearing the skin or disturbing the brittle guard hairs of the bighorn sheep. So after cutting through 70 original nails and staples with an array of saw blades, I was able to remove the backing board, and the mystery of the shrugging ovis was solved immediately. So this bighorn sheep, aptly named for its very heavy horns, had been mounted on a completely hollow laminated paper form that had simply buckled under the weight of the mount. I reached out to some colleagues of the late taxidermist Jess Frost, whose studio had produced this mount, and they confirmed that the form was almost certainly constructed from red rosin roofing paper, coated with dextrin glue, shellac, and a small amount of plaster. This process was based on the renowned taxidermist Carl Akeley's method of creating lightweight hollow mannequins from plaster casts of sculpted animals, an innovation that revolutionized the art of taxidermy at the 20th century, the turn of the 20th century. And this particular form would have been produced from a plaster cast of a clay model of a bighorn sheep sculpted by Jess Frost's uncle, Will Richards. So, having characterized both the internal form and the nature of its structural failure, I was able to proceed with my treatment. Ideally, I would stabilize, fortify, and visually restore this mount with minimal intervention and retention of all original materials, perhaps by softening the plaster form with water and reshaping it, but I could feel that there was substantial airspace behind the buckled, crumbling form, preventing me from addressing the sunken and heavily creased skin around the neck. So I grabbed a scalpel, which I used to carefully cut away only the collapsed portion of the laminated paper form, providing access to the skin, which was still thankfully responsive to manipulation. So I reshaped the deformed skin with multiple rounds of local humidification, and I retained the anatomically corrected shape by temporarily packing the empty airspace with ethafoam, Velara, and soft Tdwg while I devised the next step of the treatment, fortification. My goal was to devise a new internal system to support the mount and better distribute its weight, and though the original materials and construction of the form had proved insufficient to bear the hefty weight of the horns of the ovis, I felt it was important to retain as much of the original material as possible, as well as respect the maker's intention of constructing a hollow and lightweight form. So, after some experimentation and mock-ups with various materials that had been vetted in previous AMNH conservation projects, I covered the mount's interior with protective plastic sheeting and lined it with strips of carbon fiber cloth saturated with a West System 2-part epoxy system, building them up and conforming them to produce a partial cast of the mount's interior, creating a removable, rigid, lightweight, and extremely strong supplementary form. I used a heat gun to melt strips of thick Velara onto the exterior of the carbon fiber cloth form to provide cushioning and to minimize airspace between the mount and this rigid insert. At the same time, I consolidated and faced the crumbling original form with thick Japanese tissue paper, saturated with a 3-to-1 mixture of Lasco 498 HV and Lasco 303 HV to create a stable but still flexible working surface. And next, to better distribute the weight of the horns and lock the carbon fiber cloth insert into place, I drove a hollow aluminum rod into a block of dense ethafoam and fed it into the mount along the back of the neck, and the mount is upside down in these images, until it made contact with the rostral end of the hollow form beneath the horns. So I carved and fitted dense ethafoam blocks around the aluminum rod, fixing its position along the back of the neck, and I resigned myself to the fact that I had to do a little more harm to the object, and I grabbed another saw blade and a metal file to slightly widen the existing hole in the wood backing board to accommodate the exact diameter of the aluminum rod. I then used my hacksaw again, my favorite tool in this treatment, and cut the end of the rod flush with the exterior of the backing board, allowing the mount to hang flat against the wall. I drove the excess cut length of the rod through a second channel in the ethafoam blocks down the center of the mount, mechanically locking the entire system into place without the use of adhesive and making it completely removable. So with the internal structure stabilized and fortified, I could return the original backing board to the mount. I adhered wide strips of Remay spun-bonded polyester non-woven fabric around the interior perimeter of the mount using the same 3-to-1 Lasco adhesive mixture and a heat spatula, fitted the backing board back onto the mount and the aluminum rod, which you can see right there, and folded and adhered the excess Remay onto the exterior face of the board, securing the skin to the board in its original position and shape. The remake is not visible from the front of the mount, so I opted not to tone or visually integrate it in any way to clearly indicate that some conservation intervention had taken place. And finally, I was able to address the cosmetic damage to the ovis, having all but forgotten what the front side of the mount looked like at this point. And over time, in this sunken and misshapen state, the hollow guard hairs had become heavily creased and deformed around the base of the neck, and this deformation became especially pronounced after I reshaped the skin. So I was thrilled to conclude this treatment with some gentle and familiar conservation methods and materials. I used a preservation pencil to locally humidify and relax the guard hairs with room temperature deionized water vapor, dried them with the cool air setting of a hairdryer, and encouraged them to settle in the correct orientation by compressing the neck with soft Tdwg and light weights. So that was that. The Ovis canadensis is once again an impressive trophy mount that can support its own weight and be safely hung from the wall. From the exterior, it doesn't look like much transpired, but this treatment was highly interventive, invasive, unorthodox, and at times nauseating, and ultimately essential to restore the structural integrity and display value of this mount. The project was an exercise in balance and compromise. Several times I had to shirk some of the best practices that I generally strive to follow in my work. So when I couldn't do no harm, I did as little harm as I possibly could to achieve a specific goal. When I couldn't retain all the original materials, I removed only what was unsalvageable and compromising the stability of the mount. And when I couldn't exercise minimal intervention, I took care to intervene with respect to the original methods, materials, and intentions that went into the mount's construction. So I would like to thank my colleagues at the American Museum of Natural History, the session organizers and moderators, and all of you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. I've got one question. At the start, or halfway through your talk, you mentioned a material called Volara, but I've not heard of that before. Could you tell us what that is?
Oh, it is a very thin foam sheeting. That's it's used a lot for packing material or packing objects and supporting materials from beneath. It doesn't really have a texture, so it doesn't leave textured indentations on anything, and it's pretty adaptable. It's a nice material. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay, cool. We're going to be moving on to a panel session. So just give us 2 minutes to set up. Cool. Is that enough chairs for everyone? Wonderful. Oh, look at you all in a row. I got to get a picture of this. Awesome. Are we missing anyone? Yeah, Devin. And there's space for my imaginary friend. You have to do that thing where you sit slightly to the side, like this. So yes, okay, hi. Are there any other questions from the audience in terms of any of the presentations that you've seen today? Yes, please come up to the microphone.
Hello, just a bit of a random question, but the folks at the museum in Copenhagen, are you planning on publishing those 3D scans that you took or putting those on the website?
Is that better? Yeah.
Yes, that's the plan. I don't think they are yet publicly available, but it should happen soon, hopefully.
I think the digital team, they have a lot of plans with those scans. They really want them to get out there, but yeah, nothing has transpired for that yet. All engines on New Museum first.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Tagging on to that question, and for whoever feels like answering, I was thinking multiple times during all of your talks about the potential role of 3D modeling either before or during the kinds of treatments that you apply. And I wonder if you see potential for that, or if it would be a time saver, or save you headaches and problems later, or just as a documentation tool. I wonder what's the state of your thinking about 3D generally as part of your work?
We need to embrace it because it is kind of, I think, the future of a lot of conservation. So either embrace it or be replaced by it in some ways. I do see some problems with resolution issues at this point in some aspects. I'm especially having resolution issues with some of these smaller scaled reptiles that I'm scanning. So.
I would like to add, though, however, a lot of the work that we do, and this was mentioned at the beginning, is very much related to exhibit work. And priorities are related to exhibit work, and unfortunately, that is related to deadlines. Yeah. And a lot of the work that we end up doing is constrained by deadlines with very teeny tiny teams, and not the expertise, not the tools that we need, and all of that. And so how I wish I would have been able to do more on this 17-foot gavial. Yes, the moment that the eye broke, I would have loved to remove all of that new eye and reconstruct the old eye. I would have loved to do all of that. I didn't have time. We were opening in 2 days. So I would have loved to scan. I would have loved to do all of that. But a lot of the work that we end up doing in conservation with the small teams, lucky if you have a conservator in a natural history institution, is the problem is the deadlines.
Yeah, I think that for a lot of smaller museums too, that cost is an issue because a scanner is very expensive, and if you're doing photogrammetry, then that's a matter of thousands of pictures that you need time to process as well.
Store.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't want to gloat about what we have at the Natural History Museum, but we're very lucky. We have a 3D scanner, we have a 3D printing department almost. And just to kind of offer a kind of quick and dirty option that we actually could complete for exhibitions, we use 3D scanning of some of our orc egg collection, and then used a 3D print to do the mount making. So we could avoid kind of risking a very valuable specimen to do the initial work of the mounting process, and then we could check that to the original object. So it was actually a wonderful way to make use of the skills we have at the museum and the technology we have at the museum, while also kind of working to those incredibly tight exhibition deadlines.
A question about condition assessments, and it's twofold. One is, as you all do your investigations and you're able to discern and articulate the treatments and the materials used in the past, how do you approach the documentation of that? Is that part of one record that you attach, or do you separate and distinguish it? That's the first one. And then the second one relates to exhibitions. How do you think we can improve the involvement of conservation teams when it comes to assessing the stability of objects before they're moved, in terms of supports and mitigating damage that might happen when you're taking things off display, wherever they may be going, labs, collections, offsite storage?
Could you just repeat? We'll take those questions one at a time because they're both really good questions. Can you just repeat the first question, and we'll answer that one first?
The first question about condition assessments is, as you do your investigation, how do you approach the documentation of previous treatments? And do you do that in one report that's combined with the new treatments you're doing, or do you separate that out to say, you know, this was done 20 years ago?
For us, at least, we don't have records of anything that was done previously. So if we see something in my experience, if I see a material on an object that I know isn't part of the original object, and I can also identify most materials pretty easily in terms of how, whether it's a plastic or a fill of some material. I'll just record that in the new condition assessment. Yeah.
Yeah, so as part of a conservation report and the condition report, we have a line and a checkbox, which is if there is evidence of any previous treatments. And so it's a yes or no. And then if it's a yes, you give more details on that as part of your report, but it goes within the main report. And here we have no records of what's happened.
I think that's a situation in lots of museums too, that this stuff hasn't really been recorded in much detail before.
Yeah, and in some cases, the previous conservation interventions or restorations become condition issues because old fills discolor and darken or crumble and fall apart. So it's usually, yeah, it's a subsection of the condition section of the overall object report. A conservation report will have an object or specimen description where you include the dimensions and what you know about the maker and materials, and then a second section for condition issues that you observed before treatment, and then what you did, what you proposed, who approved the treatment, what you did to the specimen, and where your documentation, images, and things can be found.
I think a lot of our analytical methods are very useful when we're first examining too, especially like multi-band imaging can show you a lot of repairs, because past restorers were a lot of times very good at hiding what they did, so you can only see it in, say, like ultraviolet light. So.
And what was the second question? I'm going to move on because we're running out of time. But this could go on for hours.
The second question is, how do you approach or encourage teams to engage conservation in the deinstallation of exhibits as it relates to you're assessing the stability of a specimen, and how can you consult and be involved in transporting them, packing them, so that there's not more damage that happens between the time it's removed from an exhibit and then gets worked on or restored?
Can I answer? Yeah, so in Copenhagen, at least, we've basically done that ourselves. So then the problem is solved, because it's mostly the conservation team doing that alongside other museum staff. I'm not sure how it works in other museums.
Well, I was going to say, so at the NHM, I think the best thing is just to get conservation in as early as possible in any project, in any exhibition project or deinstall. Certainly at the NHM, so we'll work with the original long list for exhibition projects, and we will do initial condition assessments just for everything, and then that will go into resource development, how we're going to approach it, how the specimen list is going to get reduced down, and then again with any deinstalls in the galleries, we're just involved from the start. And I think Bethany, you probably said it yesterday about just turning up to the meetings and just kind of, yeah, we just stick ourselves in every project as much as possible.
And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I also like to do condition reports in case, before they get out of the case, things, and then as they get removed, I'm able to add notes to that condition report, and so it's all part of the deinstallation condition report. And then as it gets removed, then you help with the packing and all of that aspect of reinforcing that object or specimen. But yes, getting conservation early in the conversation is key to get these problems not even solved, it's not even started. Because once you forget about adding conservation into the conversation, that's when you get problems. You don't need to solve problems, you need to be proactive. And so getting conservation before anything happens is key.
So I'm not very familiar with working with more recently deceased internal structures. So my question is mostly for Kirby, but also anyone else who has experience with that is using, or at least looking into, techniques used in the medical field or materials used in surgical fields something that you look into, and if that's an accepted practice?
Super exciting.
I mean, I can see some potential in that. One of the repairs made to the object was actually someone stitched one of the arteries back on, which I think would work better in a living organism than a dead one, because dead organisms don't heal. I think that one of the flaws in looking at medical methods is that they're done with the idea that the organism will heal itself and make those repairs kind of unnecessary at the end. Stitches and sutures typically come out, and other implants are designed with the idea that the organism needs to keep like living and moving, functioning. Whereas what I was hoping for in my work was to prevent disassociation so that all of the pieces stayed together, but also to provide visual unity. So my repairs didn't have to be workable in that these hearts still needed to beat, but they do need to be workable in that they don't get lost.
And I think that's a very good question in the sense of what we do as conservators versus what other professions may do, and is related to what Devin had in her slide about do no harm. It's a different do no harm. Our role is also to respect the maker in the case of that heart, or in the case of a taxidermist. It could be, many other things. We also respect the intent of an artist. So we cannot go and make a stitch ourselves because it would, be similar to what other people would do in the medical field or etc. We need to respect that artist's intent. So if the artist wanted a sky to be a certain blue, we need to respect that certain blue. And so our job needs to be it has to disappear as much as possible. Our hand must not be seen. The hand that must be seen is the hand of that maker. And so we just have to disappear in the shadows.
And on that note of disappearing into the shadows, my question for the panel is that, so I'm really happy to see that actually in the 14 years I've been involved in Spnhc, that more and more museums are starting to hire their own conservators on staff. Honestly, 14 years ago, there was like 3 people, and now there's a whole panel of people. It's amazing to see. But my question for you is, how can we really advocate for museums to hire more conservators and have them as permanent members of staff?
That's hard. I think we need to make ourselves visible.
Come out of the shadows.
Yes, in a different way. Visible in the sense of also just get out of the making our profession a mystery in a way. Share what we do, share the importance of what we do, but not from an ivory tower. We are one of you, we're just a normal person that at the end of the day goes home and has a dog or a cat or is just a normal human being. We're not this elevated, human being that is like important and blah, blah, blah. And also at the same time, we have a lot of value that we can add. And our value also saves a lot of money to the people who are making decisions. And so they need to understand that by spending not that much money, because I have seen a lot of memes out there about how expensive conservators are, or like how much money conservators make. And I'm like, huh? Where? Tell me where. And that's not true. And so if you spend the money in hiring a conservator, the amount of money that you're spending is actually much, much smaller than what you end up having to spend at the end of the day for all the redesigns and all the re-whatevers that you end up having to do with the contracts and the this and the that because you messed up. And so actually spending the money first, even if, as you were saying, Bethany, in a consultant capacity, you don't have to necessarily hire a conservator always. If you have a small institution, then you don't need that. If you have a project in particular that you may need a conservator for something in particular, that's great. You can do that. There's a lot of conservators in private practice that can do that type of work. And so doing that will save you money in the long run. And so that is something that people need to understand as well.
Having an on-staff conservator for a long period of time can actually be cheaper than hiring a short-term private conservator for 1 or 2 jobs too. So it
depends on the institution and the size of the institution. Yeah.
A question?
Yes. First, thank you all for that, and thank you for that question too, because that slightly ties in. In a museum, we don't have a conservator, but love one. This is specifically for the cellulose nitrate. How, if we don't have a conservator and maybe don't know who to talk to be like, hey, do this sweet X-ray or spectrometry or whatever, how do we find out about like the cellulose nitrate in our collections?
What is it that you'd like to find out about it?
I just want to know if I'm a herpetology.
I mean, there are.
Dan's going to come to your institution
Great.
as a volunteer,
I'll give him a call.
and he will do an assessment for you. But that is what Spnhc is for. We're all part of the Spnhc Conservation Committee, and yeah, I mean, we can maybe find a way to be more accessible as a group to the wider community. If there's a way of transferring knowledge, maybe some way online, or creating a different type of network.
There's a fairly cheap microchemical tests that you can do in a controlled environment because it is, flammable. So
I think you two need to chat. And my last question is for everyone watching today. So as part of the Spnhc Conservation Committee, are there any areas of collections care conservation that you are really keen to learn about that we could potentially do a symposium about in next year at the conference?
I'd love to know how to better care for archives that are associated with collections. And there's just so many different types of media going off of cellulose nitrate, like lantern slides, maps, so many papers, photographs. Like, that's beyond my expertise. That'd be lovely.
Thank you for that. Thanks.
Could I just ask a question of the room before we go? Maybe there's no time, so just please come and find me. Has anyone worked on birds' nests, and have they done conservation treatment on them? And if you could find me and talk about that, that would be wonderful. So thank you.
And our last question will come from Laura.
So for another conference, what I would like to hear is anything about wet collections, any kind of work.
Yeah, that would be, really.
November.
Oh, yeah.
There is a conference in Switzerland in a couple of months about fluid collections. Did you hear it?
November.
Yeah, but we could have a fluid specialized session. I think that's a really good idea as well. Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panel. Thank you.